The engine room of the IGS Resolute smelled like burnt copper and recycled air. It was not a pleasant smell, but it was an honest one. Every ship that had been running long enough had that smell. It meant the engines were working. It meant the ship was alive. Darian Cole had been on board for exactly 47 minutes. He had not yet met the captain. He had not yet seen his quarters. He had not yet eaten anything since the transit shuttle, where the food had been a gray paste that tasted like sadness. He had done exactly one thing since stepping off the boarding ramp. He had gone straight to the engine room, because someone on the crew manifest had listed the secondary coolant relay as functioning, when it was very clearly not functioning. And Darian was the kind of man who could not walk past a problem without stopping to fix it. His jacket was on the floor. The engine room ran hot. He had rolled his sleeves all the way up and was halfway inside a maintenance panel, one hand on a coupling wrench, the other braced against the inner wall, when he heard someone stop walking behind him. He did not look up. He assumed it was a crew member coming to check on the noise. He heard a soft intake of breath. Then nothing. He still did not look up. The relay was almost free. Then he heard another sound, quieter, like a small animal that had just seen something it did not understand. He turned his head. Standing in the doorway of the engine room were two crew members. One was tall and gray-skinned with long, thin frills along the sides of her neck that were currently standing fully upright, which Darian did not yet know was a sign of alarm. The other was shorter, beetle-shelled, dark, with four thick arms crossed over a wide chest, and he had gone very, very still in the way that large things go still when they are deciding whether something is a threat. Darian looked at them. They looked at him. Or more precisely, they looked at his arms. He looked down at his arms. He did not see anything unusual. He saw what he always saw, the wolf on his right forearm, mid-howl, black ink on tan skin. The compass rose on his inner left wrist, the thin lines of a mountain range crossing his left forearm from elbow to wrist, the dates on his collarbone, just visible above the collar of his undershirt. He looked back up at them. "Hi," he said. The gray-skinned one made a sound that the ship's translator rendered as a very polite version of a startled yelp. The beetle-shelled one took one slow step backward. Darian put down the wrench. The gray-skinned crew member was Sura, the first officer, though Darian would not learn this for another 10 minutes. She had been on her way to the engine room to check on the new crew addition, because that was her job, and because the captain had asked her to make sure the humans settled in without any issues. She had been told that humans were unremarkable. She had read the briefing files. She had prepared herself. She had not been prepared for this. From where she stood, the markings on the human's arms looked like wounds. Long, deliberate, patterned wounds that covered every visible surface of skin. Her first thought was that he had been attacked. Her second thought was that the attack had been extremely thorough. Her third thought, which arrived half a second later and was the most disturbing of all, was that he did not seem to be in any pain. He was just looking at her, calmly, with a wrench in his hand. Sura turned to the beetle-shelled crew member beside her. His name was Thon. He was a Gruul, and Gruul did not alarm easily. They were a species that had been in wars for 300 years before they joined the consortium, and most of them still carried old scars across their shell like badges. But Thon was looking at the human's arms with an expression that Sura had never seen on a Gruul before. It was not exactly fear. It was something closer to deeply unsettled respect. Sura activated her personal scanner before she could stop herself. She tried to do it discreetly. She did not succeed. The device beeped. Darian looked at it. "You scanning me?" "I am checking for." Sura paused. Her translator searched for the right word. "Medical concern." Darian looked at his arms again, then back at her. Then something shifted in his face, and he made a sound that the translator identified as laughter, though it seemed to surprise even him. "These aren't wounds," he said. Sura stared at him. The frills along her neck rose another inch. Thon made a low sound in his chest, the kind of sound a very large creature makes when it is trying to process something that does not fit into any category it already has. Darian held out his right forearm, the one with the wolf on it, turning it so they could see it clearly. The ink was dark and precise. The wolf's head was turned slightly, its mouth open, lines of detail running through the fur. "It's a tattoo," he said. "Art. Put into the skin with a needle and ink. It doesn't hurt anymore. It hurt when I got it, but that was years ago." Sura's frills did not go down. If anything, they rose a little higher. He had said the word needle. He had confirmed the pain. And then he had said the words that made it worse. It doesn't hurt anymore. Which meant it had. Which meant he had let someone push a needle into his skin, repeatedly, across both arms and his neck, and what was visible of his chest, and had simply let it happen. Sura looked at Thon. Thon looked at Sura. Neither of them said anything. Darien picked up his wrench and turned back to the panel. Coolant relays almost fixed, he said, as if the last 2 minutes had not happened at all. Should be done in 10 minutes. Then I'd love to find my quarters. That shuttle food was rough. Sura stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she pulled out her communicator and opened a channel to the captain. Her voice was very calm and very controlled when she spoke. "Captain Vrail," she said, "the new crew member has arrived. He is. I will need to speak with you. Soon." She closed the channel and looked at Darien's back. At the ink that was visible above his collar, dark lines curving up the back of his neck. She had met many species in her years in the consortium fleet. She had shared meals with beings who breathed methane and worked alongside creatures that had no eyes. She had thought herself experienced. She was already revising that opinion. The medical bay of the IGS Resolute was quiet, which was unusual because Neva was in it. Neva was the ship's primary medic. She was Felhuri, which meant she was small and quick and had large amber eyes that noticed everything. And she had a habit of talking to herself while she worked, which meant the medical bay was rarely quiet. But right now she was not talking. She was standing over a hollow display of a bioscan readout, and she was completely, unusually, almost frighteningly silent. The readout was from the new crew member. Sura had sent it over 20 minutes ago with a message that said only, "Please review. I need a second opinion." Neva had reviewed it. She had reviewed it 3 times. She was now on her 4th pass, because she kept arriving at the same conclusion, and the conclusion made no sense. The subdermal pigmentation was not a wound. There was no scar tissue beneath the surface. No nerve damage. No infection. No sign of any trauma to the surrounding skin. The pigment particles sat in clean, deliberate layers beneath the outer skin, distributed in precise patterns, held in place by the body's own tissue. It was not a disease. It was not an injury. It was decoration. She pulled up the full body scan and stared at it. The markings covered both arms from wrist to shoulder. They crossed the upper chest and climbed the neck. There were more on the back, large shapes that the scan rendered as dark geography, a ridgeline of some kind. There were small ones too, tucked into the inner wrist, behind one ear, along the ribs. Neva made a soft sound and sat down on the edge of the medical table. She was still sitting there when Sura arrived, followed closely by Asa, the young Kethari ensign who had a habit of appearing wherever something interesting was happening. Asa was translucent-skinned, which meant her emotions were somewhat visible if you knew what to look for, and right now the faint blue tinge spreading across her collarbone meant she was deeply curious. Sura looked at the bioscan on the display. "So it is confirmed." "It is confirmed," Neva said. "He is not injured. He has never been injured in the way we assumed. The markings are entirely cosmetic. They were introduced into the skin with a needle-based instrument that deposited pigment beneath the outer surface layer." She paused. "Repeatedly. Across a very large area. Over what I estimate, based on the layering depth and pigment age, to have been many separate sessions across many years." Sura's frills rose slightly. "How many sessions?" Neva looked at the scan again. "At minimum, 20. Possibly closer to 40. The room was quiet for a moment. "He went back?" Asa said softly. Her voice was still new to certainty, the way young crew members' voices often were. "After the first time, he went back. Repeatedly." "Apparently," Neva said. Asa pressed her fingertips together in the Kethari gesture that meant she was turning something over in her mind. "And during each session, the needle was entering the skin many thousands of times." "That would be correct." Another silence. Sura had already sent her report to Captain Vrail. The captain had read it, responded with a brief message that said, "I see. Schedule a meeting," and had not said anything further. Sura knew that particular silence. It was the captain's thinking silence, which meant he was trying to fit new information into the structure of what he already knew about the universe, and the new information was not fitting easily. She understood the feeling. The door opened, and Darien appeared. He stopped when he saw all 3 of them looking at him. He looked at the bioscan display, which still showed the full image of his marked skin and clinical blue lines. He looked back at them. "Is this a meeting about me?" he asked. "We had some medical questions," Neva said carefully. "I hope you do not mind." The initial scan was routine for new crew members. Darian looked at the display again, then shrugged and walked in, dropping into a chair with the ease of someone who was not bothered by being the subject of a room's full attention. "You figured out their tattoos?" "We confirmed that, yes. And now you want to know why." Neva opened her mouth, closed it, and then decided on honesty. "We want to know how, and why, and perhaps also how." Again, Darian smiled. It was a good smile, Asa noted. It reached his eyes. "It's an old practice," he said. "Humans have been doing it for thousands of years. You take a needle, you put ink on the end, and you push it into the skin fast enough to deposit the ink below the surface layer. The skin heals over it, traps the ink, and the image stays." He held up his right arm, the wolf facing outward. "The needle goes in and out about 100 times per second when the machine is running. Depending on the size of the piece, a session can last anywhere from an hour to 6 or 8 hours. Neva stared at him. 6 to 8 hours. For a big piece. My back took 3 sessions. About 4 hours each. Sura had closed her frill down very deliberately. It was a conscious act of professional composure. And the pain during these sessions. Darian tilted his head, thinking about it honestly. Depends where. Some spots are fine. Just a scratching feeling. Other spots. He made a brief face. Ribs are rough. The ditch, he pointed to the inside of his elbow. That one stings. But it's manageable. You breathe through it. Neva looked at the scan. Then at him. Then at the scan. You breathe through 6 to 8 hours. Yeah. He said it the way someone says yes to a question about whether they take sugar in their tea. Just a fact. A small one. Asa's collarbone had gone from pale blue to a deeper, almost violet shade, which in Kethari skin meant something between wonder and overwhelmed. Thon appeared in the doorway. He had clearly followed Darian, or perhaps followed his own curiosity, which in Gruul was sometimes the same thing. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and looked at Darian with the same expression he had worn in the engine room. Not fear, but something working hard to become understanding. "My people mark kills," Thon said. It was the first full sentence he had directed at Darian. "On our shells. After a battle." Darian looked at him. "Yeah. You mark what? What are your marks record?" Darian was quiet for a moment, looking down at his arms. "The wolf. The compass. The mountains. The dates. Everything," he said. "The things I want to remember. The things I don't want to forget even when my brain tries to let them go." He touched the dates on his collarbone with 2 fingers, briefly, like a habit. "People I've lost. Places I've been. Things that changed me." Thon was quiet. His shell made a faint sound, the low creak that Gruul shells made when the creature inside was breathing slowly and deliberately. "And the pain," he said finally. "You used the pain on purpose." Darian looked at him for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think maybe I do." Thon nodded once. The nod was slow, and it was not the nod of a creature who agreed. It was the nod of a creature who had just, for the first time, found the edge of something it might one day be able to understand. Neva filed her medical report an hour later. In the notes section, she wrote, "No medical concern. Cultural practice. Painful by nature and voluntary by intent." She stared at those last words for a while before she submitted it. Voluntary by intent. She had treated hundreds of patients across a dozen species. She had seen beings endure pain because they had no choice, because their bodies demanded it, because their work required it. She had never once filed a report about someone who had chosen it, systematically, repeatedly, across years, because they wanted the result to last. She submitted the report. Then she sat quietly for a while, thinking about what it meant to carry something so permanently that even your own skin became the record of it. 7 days into the voyage, Asa still had not asked. She had wanted to. She had constructed the question in her head at least a dozen times, in at least 4 different ways, trying to find the version that was polite enough and curious enough, and not so curious that it became rude. She had practiced it in her bunk. She had rehearsed it in the corridor outside the common lounge, and then walked past without going in twice, because at the last moment her nerve had failed her. Kethari were not naturally bold. Their people were scholars and archivists, a species that had joined the consortium not through warfare or commerce, but through the slow, patient offering of knowledge. They asked questions for a living, but they asked them carefully, with preparation, with context, with the right framing. Asa had not yet found the right framing. She found it on the 8th evening, entirely by accident. She came into the common lounge because she could not sleep, and Darian was already there, alone, sitting at the far table near the observation window with a notebook open in front of him. Not a data pad, an actual physical notebook, made of pressed material that Asa recognized as paper, which she had read about but never seen in person. He was drawing in it with a thin instrument, his left hand moving slowly across the page in careful lines. He did not look up when she came in. He was focused. The observation window behind him showed the slow drift of stars, and the light caught the ink on his forearms as he moved, making the images seem, for just a moment, like they were shifting. Asa stood near the door for a moment. Then she walked to the food dispenser, got herself a warm drink, and sat down 3 seats away from him at the same table, because sitting at a completely different table would have been stranger. He glanced up. "Hey." "Hello," she said. He went back to drawing. She sipped her drink. The ship hummed around them. After a few minutes, she looked at the notebook from the corner of her eye. He was drawing something with wings. She could not tell what it was yet. "Is that going to become a tattoo?" she asked, and then immediately pressed her lips together because that was not the careful version of the question she had rehearsed. But Darian just looked down at the drawing and tilted his head. "Maybe. I haven't decided yet." Asa processed this. "You plan them first." "Sometimes. Sometimes I just walk into the shop and tell the artist what I want and let them design it. Depends on the piece." Asa set her drink down. She decided, in that moment, that there was no perfect framing and there never would be, and that the question deserved to be asked plainly, and that Darian was the kind of person who would prefer plain things to polished ones. "Would you tell me what yours mean?" she asked. "The ones you already have, if that is something you are comfortable sharing." Darian looked at her for a moment. His expression did not close. He set his pencil down, pushed the notebook to one side, and rested both arms on the table, face up, so the tattoos were visible. "Yeah," he said. "I'll tell you." He started with the wolf. He turned his right forearm toward her, and she leaned in slightly, looking at the ink. It was remarkable up close. The lines were very fine in places, very bold in others, and together they made something that was clearly alive, even though it was frozen in the skin. The animal's mouth was open. Its eyes were not aggressive. They were watchful. "I got this one when I was 22, he said. "I'd been working on a deep ice mining rig on one of our moons, Europa. There was an accident. A pressure seal failed in the lower shaft and the section flooded. 3 people I worked with didn't make it out." He was quiet for a second. "I did. I got to the emergency pod, and I sealed the hatch, and I sat in there for 11 hours waiting for the rescue ship, and the whole time I kept thinking, I should not be the one who made it." Asa did not speak. Her collarbone had gone faintly blue again. "When I got home," Darian continued, "I kept waking up in the middle of the night and not knowing where I was. And I kept thinking about wolves, for some reason. About how a wolf that survives a hard winter doesn't apologize for surviving. It just keeps going. It carries the winter in its body, and it keeps going." He touched the ink lightly with one finger. "So I had this put in my skin, so that every morning, before I did anything else, I'd look down and remember that I'm still here, and that means I owe something." Asa was quiet for a moment. "Owe something to whom?" "To the 3 who didn't make it. To whatever gave me the extra 30 seconds. He shrugged, but it was not a dismissive shrug. "I haven't figured that part out yet. But the wolf reminds me that I'm still working on it." He moved to the compass next. The one on his inner left wrist, a simple rose with 8 points, the lines clean and old. "My grandfather had a real compass. Metal, with a glass face and a spinning needle. He used to let me hold it when I was small. He said it didn't matter how lost you were. As long as you could find north, you could find your way to anywhere." Darian looked at it. "He died when I was 16. I dropped the compass by accident a year later, and it broke. The needle froze. I was more upset about that compass than I'd been at the funeral, which felt awful, but I think it's because the compass was what I had left of how he talked." He paused. "So I put the image in my skin. It doesn't spin, but it doesn't break either." Asa looked at the small 8-pointed shape on his wrist for a long time. He showed her the mountain range on his left forearm next. She had thought it was an abstract design. Up close, it was a specific place. You could tell because of the level of detail, the way one peak sat slightly lower than the others, the shape of a particular ridge. That's the view from the hill behind my mother's house, he said. Where I grew up. Northern part of my home continent. Cold most of the year. The light in the early morning used to hit those peaks in a very specific way, and they'd go orange for about 10 minutes before the sun fully came up. He smiled, and it was a different smile from the ones Asa had seen him use with the crew. This one was smaller and older. I'll never live there again. I've been off-world for 11 years. But I carry the view with me so I don't forget what it looked like when it was mine. He pulled his collar aside slightly and showed her the 2 dates on his collarbone. Just numbers. A day and month and year, twice. My parents, he said simply. Both gone now. Those are their birthdays. Asa felt something she did not have an immediate word for. The closest her language came was the term used for the feeling of holding something very old and very fragile. And the words? She asked. She had noticed the line of text along his ribs, glimpsed once when he had leaned across a console to reach something and his shirt had shifted. A line from a poem, he said. My mother used to read it to me when I was too young to understand it. She'd read it anyway, because she said the sound of good words matters before the meaning does. He was quiet. I got it inked after she died. I had to look up the poem to get the exact line right. First time I'd read it properly as an adult. A short exhale. Turned out she'd been right about it. Asa did not ask what the line said. She understood, without being told, that some things are shown but not read aloud. They sat in silence for a while. The stars moved slowly outside the window. You carry an entire life on your skin, Asa said finally. It was not something she had planned to say. It came out the way true things sometimes do, before the speaker decides whether to say them. Darian looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said. I suppose I do. The door opened. Neva stepped in, stopped when she saw them, and started to back out again. It's all right, Darian said. Come in. Neva came in slowly. She looked at Darian's arms on the table, then at Asa's face, which was now a deep, settled violet. Then back at Darian. I heard some of it, she admitted. From the corridor. I did not mean to. It's fine. She sat down. She looked at the wolf for a moment. Then she said something Asa had not expected her to say. I think I understand now, Neva said quietly. I was treating it as a medical thing, because that is how I see things. Skin. Needles. Pain. I kept getting stuck on the pain. She folded her small hands on the table. But it is not about the pain at all, is it? Darian looked at her. No. The pain is just the cost. Everything worth keeping costs something. Neva looked at the table for a while. Then she looked up. That frightens me a little, she said honestly. Still. But I think it is supposed to. Darian smiled at her. Not the crew smile. The real one. Yeah, he said. Most things that matter do. Ambassador Driss boarded the IGS Resolute at Way Station 14 with 17 pieces of luggage, 2 personal aids, a written list of dietary requirements that ran to 2 full pages, and an expression that suggested he found the ship slightly beneath his expectations. He was Vorith, a tall species, pale gold-skinned, with long vertical pupils and a posture so upright it looked like his spine had a personal opinion about slouching. The Vorith were important within the consortium, which they were aware of and reminded others of when given the opportunity. Driss was a senior diplomat, headed for a consortium summit 3 systems away, and the Resolute was the fastest available vessel on the route. He had not chosen this. He had simply ended up here. He spent his first 12 hours aboard entirely in his assigned quarters, communicating only through his aides, which suited most of the crew fine. Sura handled the diplomatic courtesies. Captain Vrail exchanged the required formal greetings. The rest of the crew went about their work and stayed out of the diplomatic section of the ship. Darian was not the kind of person who moved quietly through formal spaces. He was the kind of person who went where the work was. On the second day of Driss's stay aboard, a ventilation unit on the upper corridor of the diplomatic section began making a high-pitched cycling sound. It was not dangerous. It was simply annoying and persistent, the kind of mechanical complaint that a ship makes when one small component is wearing down. Sura sent a maintenance request, and Darian picked it up, because Darian picked up most maintenance requests, because fixing things was what he did when he was not doing everything else. He came to the diplomatic section with his toolkit at his hip and his sleeves already rolled up, because the upper corridor ran warm due to the ventilation problem itself. The panel was near the ceiling at the far end of the hall. He set up a small stepladder, climbed it, and opened the panel. He was working quietly, focused on the cycling component, when he heard footsteps in the corridor below him. He did not look down. The component was almost free. The footsteps stopped. Darian removed the worn piece, turned it over in his hand to confirm the problem, and reached into his kit for the replacement. Only then did he glance down. Ambassador Driss was standing in the middle of the corridor, looking up at him. Both of the ambassador's aides were a step behind him, equally still. All three of them were staring. Darian nodded. "Morning." No one replied. He turned back to the panel and began fitting the new component. Below him, he heard a very quiet, very controlled exchange in Vorith, which his personal translator rendered imperfectly but adequately as something along the lines of, "What is that on its arms, and why is it up there?" One of the aides responded with something that sounded like, "I am not certain, sir." The other added something about the medical bay. Darian finished fitting the component, ran a quick test cycle to confirm it was working, and climbed back down the ladder. When he turned around, Driss was still there. The ambassador had not moved. His long vertical pupils had contracted slightly, which in Vorith was either extreme focus or extreme displeasure, and from the set of his mouth, it was probably both. "Are you the maintenance crew?" Driss asked. His translator rendered his voice in very precise, very clipped tones. "One of them," Darian said. He picked up his stepladder and folded it. "Ventilation's fixed. Should be quiet now." Driss was not looking at the ventilation panel. He was looking at Darian's arms, with the particular expression of someone who has identified something that needs to be addressed by someone above their pay grade. "You are injured," Driss said. Darian paused. He had had this conversation 3 times now in 10 days. He was getting better at the opening. "Not injured," he said patiently. "Tattoos. Decorative ink under the skin. Human cultural practice." Driss looked at him for a long, flat moment. "You were marked." "I marked myself. Over a period of years. Voluntarily." The ambassador's aides exchanged a look. Driss turned slightly away, which was a Vorith gesture that Darian's translator did not decode, but which generally communicated that the conversation was over and a different conversation was about to begin elsewhere. Darian picked up his kit and walked back toward the maintenance section. Behind him, he heard Driss speaking quietly to his aides again. The translator caught fragments. "Visible damage and unsettling, and someone should speak to the captain." Darian sighed through his nose and kept walking. By the time he reached the engine bay, his communicator was already buzzing. It was Sura. "The ambassador has filed a crew welfare concern," she said. She sounded tired. "He is requesting a formal review of your assignment status." I figured. He used the phrase, "visibly distressed crew member." "I'm not distressed." "I know that. I will need to explain it to him." A pause. Again. Darian set his kit down and sat on the edge of the workbench. "How'd the first explanation go?" "He asked me 3 times if I was certain you were not in pain." Another pause. "I told him I was certain." "He asked how I could be certain if you had clearly been subjected to something." "I told him the markings were intentional." "He asked who had permitted it." "I told him you had permitted it, yourself, as an adult, over many years." "He asked to speak with the captain." Darian let out a long breath. "Right." The captain called him, and 20 minutes later. Vrel's office was spare and orderly, the way Sarati spaces tended to be. Everything had a place and was in it. The captain himself was behind his desk, and he looked like a man who had spent part of his afternoon explaining human cultural practices to a diplomat who had not enjoyed being educated. "Sit down, Darian," Vrel said. Not crew member Cole. Not the formal address. Just his name, which meant the captain was not treating this as a disciplinary matter. Darian sat. "The ambassador is uncomfortable," Vrel said. He said it without judgment, simply as a fact on the table to be dealt with. "He has requested that you be assigned to sections of the ship where you will not come into contact with his delegation." He framed it as a welfare concern, but his actual concern is that your appearance unsettles him. Darian said nothing. "I have not agreed to his request," Vrel said. "You are assigned to this ship. You have work to do on this ship. I will not move you because a passenger finds your culture difficult to understand." He paused. However, Darian echoed. "We have a formal diplomatic dinner in 4 days. The ambassador will attend. Several of his consortium contacts will be joining via long-range transmission." Vrel looked at him steadily. The ambassador has made it clear that he expects a formal crew presence at this dinner, and I intend to have one. I would like you to be part of it. Darian looked at him. Why me? Because, Vrail said carefully, I believe that some things are better addressed directly than managed quietly. The ambassador is not the only person in the consortium who will encounter humans as the consortium continues to expand. He will not be the last person to mistake your culture for something alarming. He folded his hands on the desk. You explained your markings to Sura, to Thon, to Nevo and Asa. I have heard from all four of them, independently, that the explanation changed something for them. Darian was quiet. I am not ordering you, Vrail said. I am asking you to sit at a table with a man who finds you unsettling and give him the same thing you gave the rest of my crew. Darian looked at the window on the far wall, at the dark between the stars. One condition, he said. Vrail waited. I tell it my way. No briefing notes. No prepared remarks. No diplomatic version. Vrail held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Your way, he agreed. Darian stood up. He rolled his sleeve down out of habit, then stopped, looked at the fabric over the wolf, and rolled it back up again. For days, he said. For days, Vrail confirmed. Darian walked out. In the corridor, he passed one of Driss's aides, who looked at his arms and then quickly looked at the ceiling. Darian said nothing. He went back to the engine bay, picked up his kit, and found the next thing that needed fixing. There was always something on a ship that needed fixing. He had learned to take comfort in that. The dinner table silence. The diplomatic dining hall on the IGS Resolute was the nicest room on the ship, which was not saying a great deal, but someone had tried. The lighting was warm and low. The table was long and set properly, with actual fabric on it and real servingware instead of the standard crew issue. There were even small decorative pieces at the center of the table, polished stones from 3 different systems that the captain had collected over the years and brought out only for occasions like this one. There were 12 people at the table. 6 were crew, Vrail at the head, Sura to his right, Neva, Thon, Asa, and Darian. 3 were Driss's delegation, including the ambassador himself and his 2 aides. 3 more joined by long-range transmission on a suspended display at the far end of the room, their images slightly blue-edged and a half-second delayed, as long-range transmissions always were. One of the 3 on the display was another Vorith diplomat named Esser. The other 2 were Consortium Council observers, a species Darian did not recognize, small and pale and attentive, watching the room with many lensed eyes. Darian wore his dress uniform, which was navy blue and had a cleaner cut than his working clothes. He had rolled his sleeves back to the elbow out of pure habit and had not unrolled them. His arms were visible. The wolf looked back at whoever happened to glance his way. Ambassador Driss had looked at Darian when he sat down and then looked immediately away, in the manner of someone who had decided not to engage with something until absolutely necessary. The dinner proceeded through its early stages without incident. There was food, which was served in the consortium style with multiple small courses, and there was conversation, which was careful and formal in the way that diplomatic conversations always are, full of careful acknowledgments and politely deflected points, and the kind of agreement that doesn't actually commit anyone to anything. Darian said very little. He ate. He listened. He answered questions when asked directly, which was not often, because he was crew and the focus of the table was on Driss and the consortium business that brought the ambassador aboard. It was going fine. Then Driss set down his utensils and looked at the center of the table, and said, in the controlled voice of a man making a formally phrased point, I do want to note, for the record, that I find it irregular that crew members presenting with extensive physical marking are integrated into formal diplomatic settings without prior disclosure to guests. The table went quiet. Sura's frills shifted fractionally. Neva's ears went very slightly flat. Asa's collarbone went blue immediately. Thon did not move at all, which for a Gruul was a statement in itself. Vrail looked at Driss for a moment. The crew of the Resolute is introduced in full at the start of every diplomatic voyage. Crew member Cole's file was included in your briefing materials. His file did not mention this, Driss said, gesturing in Darian's direction without looking at him directly. His file mentioned that he is human. Human cultural practices, including cosmetic traditions, are documented in the Consortium Cultural Database. I have no interest in the cultural database's documentation of Ambassador. It was Darian's voice. Quiet. Not loud enough to cut, but present enough to stop. Everyone looked at him, including, after a moment, Driss. Darian had his glass in one hand and both forearms resting on the table edge. He was not tense. He looked, if anything, like someone who had been waiting for a moment to say something and had been patient about it. Would you let me tell you about them? He said. The markings. 2 minutes. Then if you're still uncomfortable, I won't bring it up again. Driss looked at him for a long moment. His expression was the precise, controlled look of a man deciding whether engaging would be worse than not engaging. On the display at the far end of the table, the diplomat Esser leaned very slightly forward. The 2 council observers had gone very still. 2 minutes, Driss said. Darian set his glass down. He did not begin with an explanation of what tattoos were. He did not start with history or cultural context or definitions. He started with a morning on Europa 11 years ago, and he told it the way he had told it to Asa. Plainly, in order, without drama, because the facts were dramatic enough on their own. He told them about the pressure seal, the flooding lower shaft, the 3 names of the people who had not made it to the pod. He said the names clearly because he thought they deserved to be said. He told them about the 11 hours in the emergency pod, and about coming home and not sleeping, and about the wolf. He held up his right arm, the wolf facing the room. I had this put into my skin so that every morning, before I reached for anything else, I would look at this and remember that I am still here and they are not, and that means I owe something. He put his arm down. The pain of getting it done was real, and I chose it on purpose, because the things I was carrying deserved to cost something. The room was very still. Even the hum of the ship seemed to have quieted, though that was not possible. He moved to the compass without waiting for a response. The story was shorter this time, and simpler. A grandfather, a broken instrument, the need to keep a direction. He showed them the small rose on his inner wrist, and did not explain further than necessary. Then the mountain range. He told them about the hillside and the early morning light and his mother's voice, and he told it in 2 sentences, because 2 sentences were enough, and because some things lose something when you explain them too much. Then the dates. He pointed to his collarbone without pulling the collar aside. 2 numbers. My parents' birthdays. Both gone. He did not say anything further about those. Then he looked at the room. Driss was looking at the table. Not at Darian. At the table, in the way a person looks when they are listening to something that has gotten past the defenses they had prepared. The diplomat Esser on the display was no longer leaning forward. She was sitting back, but her expression had changed in a way that was hard to define, like something in it had become less formal. The 2 council observers were looking at each other in the rapid, near-silent way of beings who shared a language that did not need words. Thon's shell made the low, slow creak of deep breathing. Asa's collarbone was violet. Darian picked up his glass again. I carry all of it in my skin, he said. Because I am human, and humans forget things when the years pile up, and these things are not allowed to be forgotten. The pain of putting them there was the price of making sure of that. He looked at Driss. That is what the markings are, Ambassador. They are not wounds. They are records. Every one of them is something I chose to keep. He took a drink. Silence. It was Driss who broke it, after a long enough pause that it was clear the silence had not been comfortable for him. He was not the kind of man who liked being in feelings he had not prepared for. How many? He said. His voice was different from before. Still controlled, but different. How many do you carry? Darian considered the question. Enough, he said. And room for more. Driss looked at the table again. The dinner continued. The conversation found its way back to consortium business and diplomatic logistics, because there was work to do, and it would not wait for feelings. But something had shifted in the room, the way air shifts when a window is opened, almost imperceptible but present. At one point near the end of the meal, Asa leaned toward Neva and whispered something. Neva looked at Darian and then looked at her plate and made a small sound that was almost, not quite, but almost a laugh. Thon said nothing for the rest of the evening. But when the crew filed out after the formal close of the dinner, he walked beside Darian instead of ahead of him, which for a Gruul was a specific thing. It meant something about proximity and trust that Thon would never say out loud and did not need to. Vrail caught Darian's eye as they left the room and gave him a single, brief nod. Darian nodded back. In the corridor, Driss's senior aide fell into step briefly near Darien. She did not say anything, but she looked at the wolf on his forearm for just a second before she turned away, and it was not the look from the first day, the one full of alarm and distance. It was something else, something quieter. Darien went back to his bunk and lay down and looked at the ceiling for a while. He thought about the 3 names he had said at the dinner table. He thought about how saying names out loud in a room full of people was different from carrying them privately, how it made them real again for a moment, in a room they had never been in, among people who had never known them. He thought that they might have liked that. The galaxy learns to look. 3 days after the dinner, Thon knocked on the door of Darien's quarters. This was notable for several reasons. The first was that Thon had not knocked on anyone's door in the 2 years he had been crew on the Resolute, preferring to meet people in common spaces or functional ones. The second was that it was late, past the end of the last duty rotation, when most of the crew was resting. The third was that when Darien opened the door, Thon was holding a flat piece of alloy plate in one of his 4 hands, and his expression was a thing that Gruul faces did not do often or easily, uncertain. Darien looked at him. Thon looked at Darien. Then Thon held out the alloy plate. "I want to mark something," he said. "On my shell. Here." He pointed to a section of his upper left shoulder plate, near the joint where the shell met the neck. "But I do not know the right shape. My people mark kills. This is not a kill. It is something else, and I do not have the form for it." Darien looked at the alloy plate. It was blank. A practice surface. "What is it?" he asked. "The thing you want to mark." Thon was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who did not know the answer. The silence of someone deciding whether to say it. "The 3 names," he said finally. "The ones you said at the dinner. The ones from the flooding." He stopped. "I lost 3 from my own unit. Before the consortium. Before the Resolute. I have never marked them because they were not kills. They were losses. There is no form in my tradition for that." He looked at the alloy plate. "But you carry your losses. You showed me it is possible to carry a loss. I want to carry mine." Darien said nothing for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said, "and tell me about them." They stayed up for 3 hours. Thon talked about his 3, haltingly at first, then with more steadiness as the words came. Darien listened and sketched on paper and asked questions about shapes that meant something in Gruul tradition and shapes that did not. By the end of it, he had 3 designs, simple and precise, that Thon could look at and say, "Yes, that is the right form for this." Thon took the sketches. He looked at them for a long time. Then he put them carefully inside his shell at the inner joint where Gruul carries small items of value, and he left without saying anything further, which was not rudeness. It was the Gruul form of thank you that went beyond what words could carry. Darien sat at his desk for a while after that. Then he picked up his own notebook and kept drawing. Across the ship, other small things were happening. Asa spent 4 evenings writing. Not a personal log. A formal academic paper, structured properly, with citations and referenced case studies, addressed to the Consortium Academic Council. She had never submitted anything to the council before. She was too junior. But she wrote it anyway, because she had something to say and the Academic Council was the right place to say it. The paper was about human cultural memory practices. It used Darien as a case study, with his permission, which she had asked for very formally, and he had granted very casually. She argued that humans were the only known species in the consortium who had developed a practice of encoding personal history directly into the body, and that this practice was not a curiosity or an anomaly, but a window into something fundamental about how humans experience time, loss, and continuity. The paper's final line read, "They are, perhaps, the most committed record keepers in the known galaxy, and not one of their most important records lives in a databank." She submitted it nervously on the last evening before the Resolute docked at the summit station. She received a response 6 days later from a council archivist she had never met, asking for a longer version with expanded case examples. She would spend the following year writing it, and it would eventually be read by more people than she had ever expected. Neva's change was smaller, but no less real. She had stopped thinking about the tattoos medically. She still noticed them, because she was a medic and she noticed everything, but the category they lived in had shifted. They were no longer under the heading of things to monitor or explain. They were simply part of Darien, the way his voice was and his habit of fixing things before anyone asked, and the way he always knew where the nearest tool was without looking. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the dinner, she came into the engine bay with 2 cups of something warm from the dispenser and handed him one and said, out of nowhere, "Do you ever get a tattoo for something good? Something that isn't a loss?" Darian took the cup and looked at her. Then he set it down, reached up and pulled the neck of his collar aside, and showed her the small sun ink just below his left collarbone. It was simple, 8 clean rays, a round center, nothing elaborate. "I got this the day I was accepted into the consortium crew program," he said. "First thing in my life I'd worked toward on purpose, on my own terms." Neva looked at the sun. It was the smallest tattoo she had seen on him. Then something happened in her face. Not a big thing, just a small shift at the corners of her eyes and mouth. She laughed. It was a short laugh, not loud, the kind that arrives before you can stop it. She pressed one hand over her mouth and looked away and then looked back. "Of all of them," she said, still smiling, "the one for something good is the smallest one." Darian looked down at it. "The losses take up more room," he admitted. "That's just how it is." Neva looked at him for a moment. "I think that is the most human thing you have ever said." He thought about that. "Probably," he agreed. Ambassador Driss left the Resolute at the summit station without speaking to Darian again directly. But 3 weeks after the voyage ended, a formal addendum appeared in the consortium crew standards documentation filed under cultural practices by his office. It was brief and written in the careful, dense language of diplomatic paperwork, but its meaning was simple. It said that human crew members might present with extensive subdermal pigmentation across the body. It said this was a voluntary cultural practice of significant personal meaning. It said it should not be logged as a medical concern, a welfare flag, or evidence of physical distress. And at the very end, in a final line that was unusual for consortium formal documentation, which tended toward the factual and dry, it said, "This practice is, upon reflection, a form of personal biography, and should be treated accordingly." Sura read the addendum and showed it to Vrail. Vrail read it and said nothing, but the faint movement of his frills said something that his words were too composed to. Sura forwarded it to Darian. He read it once. Then he saved it and did not mention it to anyone. On the last evening before the Resolute took its next assignment, Darian went to the observation deck. It was empty at that hour, just the long window and the dark and the slow shift of stars as the ship moved. He sat on the bench that ran along the base of the window and leaned back against the cold glass and looked at his arms in the low light. The wolf, the compass, the mountains, the dates, the words along his ribs that he had never read aloud to anyone, the sun on his collarbone, 11 other marks between them, each one a thing he had decided was too important to leave only in memory. He traced his finger along the wolf's outline slowly, the way he did when he was thinking about something without words yet. Then he opened his notebook and found the drawing he had been working on for the past 2 weeks. The thing with wings that Asa had seen him drawing the night she had asked him to explain everything. He had been refining it, slowly, adding and removing and adjusting until the shape felt right. He looked at it for a while. He did not yet know exactly what it meant. He had a few ideas, but none of them had settled into the right words yet, and he had learned long ago not to rush that part. The meaning came when it was ready. The image came first. He knew it would mean something about this voyage, about a crew that had looked at him with fear, and then with curiosity, and then with something that had quietly become understanding, about a species, his species, carrying their whole lives on their skin and being found strange for it, and then being found something else. He closed the notebook. Outside the window, the stars were very far away and very still, the way they always looked from a moving ship. He knew they were not still. He knew every one of them was moving, burning, changing, and the stillness was only a matter of distance and speed,